Hello everyone and welcome to this Ranger4 webcast. Today's webcast will look at DevOps Toolchain Reviews. The webcast will be brought to you by Helen Bill, Head of DevOps at Ranger4. If you have any questions during the session, please use either the question or chat feature in the GoToWebinar control panel, and I will ask them at the end. For now, I'll pass you over to Helen.
Thank you, Tej, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone on today's webcast. As Tej said, I'm Helen, and today the subject of our webcast is the Ranger4 DevOps Toolchain Review. So many of you on the call will be very familiar with this acronym, originally coined by John Willis and Damien Edwards, to summarise the key components that make up the DevOps philosophy. That's culture, automation, metrics and sharing, and later just Humble added their L for lean. Today, though, we're going to be talking about DevOps Toolchain Reviews, so we're going to be focusing mainly on the A piece of the puzzle, so the automation piece. So this quote from Jez Miller comes from this year's Puppet Labs State of DevOps report. It's a bit of a must-read for anybody interested in DevOps, actually, so we'll be including a link to that in the follow-up email after this webcast today. The point here really, though, is that kind of stories like this abound in the marketplace, the benefits of implementing automation into the software development and delivery process. And many of our customers are very able to clearly articulate and actually quantify the benefits that they're achieving through automation today. Primarily around things like increased pace of change alongside improving quality. So lots of people are starting to do this. There's lots of noise in the marketplace about what can be done. What Jez was really talking about, though, is kind of this concept of shifting left. So being able to do things like test earlier allows organisations to find and fix defects much more easily and cheaply and reduce the cost of production outages. Again, this slide is kind of my slide, but it's an interpretation of some of the text in the State of DevOps report when it explains how when we combine both continuous delivery with lean management practices, they amplify each other and they enable ever-improving delivery of better and better software. So on the left, you can see kind of the component parts of continuous delivery. So we've got continuous integration and automated testing. That's all sorts of testing, including integration testing. In fact, a big part of the report this year was around architecting applications in a way that allows them to be deployable and testable in components. So using things like microservices. And they were making some very strong points in the report about how actually don't get too hung up on what type of system it is. If you're familiar with Gartner's pace layering, things like systems of record and systems of innovation, because it doesn't matter how old the system is. What matters is how it's architected in a way that we can deploy pieces of it or test pieces of it. So deployment automation, I've mentioned a few times in that is another important part. And then version control of all production artifacts, so knowing what is where when. And then the lean management principles, so very much, those of you again on the call, many of you will have read the Phoenix project, so you'll be very confident or very familiar with the concepts around work in progress and unplanned work and using things like Kanban to enable you to see work streams and identify bottlenecks and keep that flow going. And then finally, monitoring tools. So kind of these have been our three big tool areas for DevOps for a while, actually. Testing, deployment automation, and monitoring, or being able to fail smart or fast. So, DevOps is a bit of a grassroots thing. This quote from Adrian, you know, it's all a bit debatable, I think, what some of the things that Adrian's saying here. Executive sponsorship, I think, is absolutely key for DevOps transformations to be successful. You know, we need those execs to assign budget, mandate change through the organisation, but it is imperative that these key technologists and this groundswell happens from the bottom up, if you like, if you want to use traditional organisational hierarchical terms. But the whole DevOps movement, of course, or label, as some people prefer to kind of think of DevOps, because it's a nice, neat little word that means lots of different things to lots of different people, but it's really about changing IT for the better. I do lots of other presentations about why DevOps has become such a used term, but I'm not going to dwell on that too much today. But suffice to say, DevOps began as a hashtag on Twitter. I don't think you get much more grassroots than that. And it's true that in many organisations, in fact probably most organisations, we see DevOps starting as a grassroots movement. And if any of you were on my DevOps Patterns webcast last week, you would have seen some of my organizational structures as kind of organizational evolutions as DevOps becomes more prevalent through the organization. In fact, we'll send you a link to those slides as well at the end of this presentation. So add to the fact that DevOps has kind of started grassroots and the fact that we've been through a pretty major global recession, I think we'll all agree, and all the organizations we've worked with have had very constrained resources and budgets over the past few years. So what we've observed over and over again is groups of smart thinking, change-oriented technologists take on DevOps and start tackling it from a grassroots level. And what that's often kind of manifested itself as is these engineers and developers picking and implementing often open source tools because they're free, and often under the radar and mostly without management approval, mostly without any kind of formalized tool strategy, and not necessarily architecting or thinking about the scale of what that's going to look like, the security around those type of tools, and the reliability of them in long-term production environments. So again, this is another kind of grassroots quote, and I'll explain in a moment why we've got these ones together. I think it's very arguable, the comment here that's the summary comment, that DevOps is predominantly a grassroots developers movement. I think it's true. It's often and mostly it starts as a grassroots movement, but from our experience, we see it coming equally from the ops side and the development side. And in many organisations, we engage with both simultaneously when they might not even necessarily be talking that effectively together at that point, but we can help them come together. And then this last quote. Yeah, DevOps is big. I haven't got the slides in this presentation today, but you've probably seen them before if you've been on other webcasts. You just do a search on Google Trends for anything with DevOps in it, just DevOps or DevOps engineer. You'll see some pretty big spikes. So we know it's big, we know it's getting bigger. What I found interesting though is all three of the quotes that I've just shown you were from a single article on computerweekly.com by Kath Everett in April of this year. So I'm not sure if it's good journalistic approach to have that much repetition, but I think that does show you the sense that grassroots is a big part of DevOps. So this is the article itself, and we'll send you a link to that as well today. So in summary, what we're seeing as a consequence of this DevOps movement coming quite grassroots is this initial foray into trying to do some continuous delivery, implement some automation, some fragmentation of different people trying different tools in different ways. So what we're finding is that a lot of organisations are kind of coming to us and asking for some help in kind of doing a DevOps Toolchain 2.0, if you like, the next evolution, working out why bits of it are broken, which bits are missing, how to actually deliver on the promise of continuous delivery, if you'll excuse the tautology there. So I wanted to talk to you today about one of our customers who kindly has agreed to be a publicly referenceable case study for us in the DevOps manner. So Tarocca are based in London. They develop mobile applications for banks, in particular kind of texting, things that text consumers from retail banks. And they came to us saying a number of things. So they felt they'd tried to develop a tool chain, so they had some pieces already, and we'll cover off in a minute which pieces they already had and what they were doing, but they felt that there was opportunity to do more. So they had this idea of reducing the overall cycle time, so improving the cadence of change. And we had a training session, a DevOps Foundation course training session with a number of customers a few weeks ago, and one of the customers was talking about the aha to ka-ching moment. So about this idea of being able to measure and squish that time from that thought that would be a good feature to deliver and actually that get into the customer. They had a few quality issues that were impacting a little bit on some of the customer perceptions. Again, not unusual, I think, for anybody these days. And just generally wanted to drive efficiencies across the whole SDLC. And there's, some other things we had these conversations with them about. They wanted to make releases much more predictably successful and consistent. So they wanted to have this concept of like breathing. So instead of everyone holding their breath for a release weekend and hoping and crossing fingers and praying that it was going to be all right, and then breathing a huge sigh of relief, or running around trying to fix the thing that's broken, actually releasing so frequently and with so much knowledge and templating and consistency around what they were doing that they could do it very smoothly. They also wanted to be able to recover very quickly from any failure, which was something they were finding quite difficult, and we'll talk a bit about that again when we look at the tools in more detail in a minute. But when you've got a lot of scripts and not a lot of automation, it makes troubleshooting difficult, and it makes redeploying a last known good state quite tough as well. And then they had a typical problem as well, which we'll cover off in a bit more detail, but a bottleneck around the release and deployment process where it looks like a single point of failure, and one person really helped all of the knowledge there. So having those conversations with Tailrock, we proposed to them that we undertake a DevOps Toolchain Review. This is our kind of standard description of what we do in a DevOps Toolchain Review from a statement of work. This is obviously Tailrock's statement of work. But as you can see, it's providing an in-depth and very technical review. So we do lots of work with organisations that we talk about kind of around discovery and maturity, and lots of organisational and cultural analysis. But the primary focus of this piece of work is to be very technical and focus in on the tool chain primarily. You'll see how interconnected all of these things are, though, when we go through what the recommendations that we made as we presented our final report to Tailrock. So as you can see, the deliverables of this piece of work are recommendations for a roadmap to get you further towards continuous delivery and moving up the DevOps maturity scale and achieving all of these things around consistency and predictability and reliability. So this is our DevOps maturity scale that we use a lot at Ranger4. It's in virtually all of the presentations that we do. It is heavily distilled, as you will be able to see, but it's a really good starting point to have a conversation with people about where they think they are, and then we can start measuring where they are, we can start putting some goals in place, and we can start doing things and improving them up that scale and reporting back and showcasing success and tweaking bits that haven't worked so well. So Tailrock had been using some DevOps principles. They had started building a continuous delivery pipeline or DevOps toolchain using quite a few different components. So they had some Bash and Python scripts. They already had a bit of Jira and Confluence in use. They had Subversion and rules. They were using Git and Nexus and Jenkins and SonarQube and Rundeck. And the list kind of goes on and on. They had had some forays into using Puppet for some orchestrations, and they hadn't had much success with that. And their QA and testing department had recently been brought back in-house from what had been outsourced, and tools they were starting to use or starting to think about using things like JUnit and Selenium. So at this point in the engagement, we placed them around position 2 on this maturity scale at the start of the toolchain review. So that is just starting about DevOps, thinking about cultural change. You know, they had starting to write scripts and looking at test automations. So that's one of the maturity scales that we use. I wanted to put this one in as well. This is Gartner's Continuous Delivery Maturity Matrix. Again, we use this a lot during all of our DevOps reviews, whether they're about continuous delivery or tool chains, or whether they're more generic looking across the whole board. We don't necessarily agree with everything on here. In fact, I think there's a glaring hole around requirements management. I also frequently pick on the release management and compliance and deployment maturity scales. But it is really, really useful as a discussion starter, and you know, starting to try and analyse which bits are successful and what things need to happen to move up the scale. So this is one of the things that we use during the toolchain review, which breaks down a bit like this. So it's a 3-day single consultancy or consultant engagement. So on the first day, we come on site and we kick off with a key project stakeholder, and that's just typically one person we try to keep at this point to own that project. And we start to summarise and architect that current DevOps toolchain. Then run a couple of workshops, depending on the size and complexity of the organisation. They we have to pick how many people can be in that workshop, basically, so they can't be too big. So in very large global enterprises, we need to kind of pick on one or two applications. Telrock are a relatively small company, so actually we were able to get pretty much everyone that was involved in these areas involved in the workshop. So workshop 1 is around ideas, or really about requirement solicitation and the customer, and then the second workshop is about build and integration and development. Then we have a close look, so hands-on exploration of the existing toolchain at customer. So actual demos, actually like getting our hands a little bit dirty, like see if we can see an integration or a release or a test going on. Second day, we review the previous day's findings with our key stakeholder, and then we run another couple of workshops around test and run that afternoon, and then we do a wrap up and write up some findings. So what could you expect the deliverables of his work like this to look like or to be? Well, I think probably the best way to explain that is actually maybe to look at the set of recommendations that we gave to Telrock after our investigation with them. So, and you'll see the flow of these. There are going to be 12 recommendations in all, and you'll see a flow through the same kind of process as we just described around the workshop. So this kind of like very broken down SDLC, where we look at ideas, and then we look at build, and then we look at test, and then we look at run. So our first recommendation was around improving the use of user stories and the way they're developed in requirements. So we observed a few things here, and I have to emphasize that we see this a lot in organizations, that requirements need some further maturity. So first of all, we noticed that requirements were often entering the book of work sort of potentially side of desk requests, so not going through the full collaborative feature development and prioritization process that they should do. And therefore they weren't being fully developed or presented to software developers as user stories, and there wasn't enough detail really around acceptance criteria. They were using Jira, so they were entering requirements into Jira, but the user stories could be more detailed, and they weren't being really used, again, as this collaboration point. So you remember CAMS, and the S in CAMS is for sharing. So collaboration is a really important part of DevOps. It gets things done faster. It means we're more accurate about the things that we're doing because we have a full understanding about them. So a number of recommendations here, which we're running some user story mapping workshops, doing some agile coaching, which is a very common follow-on piece of work for us in this sort of engagement. We often have consultants that will come in for 2 to 4 days a week through a series of sprints and just keep on coaching various different teams through agile. Improving these user stories within Jira and making them much more detailed was a really big part of what they need to do, and managing this backlog of requirements and understanding what a backlog looks like. So a firm tools recommendation there was really to continue with the use of Jira, a very popular and extensive and capable tool. So the second recommendation was around the organisational structure. So this is, again, a very common problem, very common starting point, and you'll notice that this isn't a particularly technical recommendation, actually. This would fall into, we tend to categorise things in the SDLC and then in DevOps in 3 ways. So we used to talk about people, process, tools a lot, and now I talk about culture, automation, interaction. So this would fall into our kind of culture recommendations. So it's around an organisation change. It's very closely aligned with agile recommendations around basically getting away from the IT silos of dev, BA, test and release and security, and actually arranging the various skills around a product owner. In addition to this helping have a more customer-centric view, because you're putting the product owner sort of driving the development forward, what happens often is if people have lots of bespoke projects and haven't consolidated products, it can often be quite unscalable. So you could have multiple environments per customer, projects per customer, software builds per customer, which is quite intensive, can lead to quite a lot of technology sprawl. it can result in quite a complex application stack, which can have knock-on effects in terms of scalability and cycle time. Some of the challenges around doing this kind of change, though, are around product owners not always having masses of software development or agile or iterative development knowledge. So one of the things that we often recommend, which kind of goes hand in hand with some of the agile coaching, is doing simulations with these people, these product owners, to help align understanding about what we're trying to do when we do software. But overall, what we're driving for here is having this outside-in approach, which is something we've all been striving for many years, but DevOps gives us another chance to get a good run at that. So the third recommendation, still in the ideas or the requirements section, was really about consolidating onto Confluence and Jira Service Desk. So there was a bit of tools fragmentation going on, again, extremely common in organisations. Actually becomes a bit more common when people follow the recommendation that we just made, because one of the things that happen is you split up a test team effectively, you put testers in your product teams, and then the testers forget or don't have time to talk to each other so much, and then they might start trying tools without sharing that information with other people. But having a single tool helps collaboration much better. So again, firm tools recommendations here, Jira again, and Confluence, a very effective collaboration platform. So the fourth recommendation, and now we're starting to move into the build section. So I kind of alluded to this issue earlier when I was talking about scripts. What we see a lot happen is an evolution, which is basically somebody's doing a lot of manual deployments, manual releases. They start writing some scripts, they write more and more scripts until they've created this really big script kind of monster, and they've saved themselves loads of time, but they've created something that only really they understand. And this gives us a single point of failure, which is an issue. It causes a lot of problems around things like release weekends and things like that, and you have this concept of a hero, but they're not really a hero, they're a bottleneck. You have people having to ask other people for deployments all the time, so testers have to ask development, ops engineers have to ask development. Deployments are being written on custom scripts, which they're not optimized and hardened, so they're going to fail a lot. So key recommendations here are about simplifying the deployments so that everybody can understand them and use them, and then a move towards self-service through tooling will again help release that hero, release that bottleneck. Everyone won't be waiting and asking people to do stuff for them because they'll have some control to assist. And by using this sort of tool, we can start implementing some consistency and some templates, and we'll come on to that in a moment in a bit more detail. Another part of the recommendation, though, is around the traceability of the deployments and ensuring that version numbers, so we talked about version control a little bit earlier, but ensuring that those version numbers are retained all the way through to production deployment and are moved inline in Jira so we can see exactly what's happening. And this becomes really important when we're trying to hit one of those high-level goals that we talked about earlier in terms of being able to measure from the aha to the ka-ching, so knowing how much effort it took for us to get that feature from idea to running in the live environment, and how much it's making the business, or how much it's worth to the business whilst it's running in live. We also recommended the use of a Maven release plugin here to automate some of the releases and help with branching and versioning. And we talked a little bit about this earlier when we talked about making things visible, when we talked about the lean techniques, lean management techniques. But yes, having a big dashboard just to be able to see what's being deployed and what's going through would be really useful here. So another firm tools recommendation. So there are a few different release tools in the marketplace. One is IBM Urban Code, two flavors to it, release and deploy, which would help with this problem here. So the fifth recommendation was around the build time, so improving the build time. So they had multiple builds for different clients. Each was containing custom code as well as configuration. There's a few issues with jobs falling out of line and needing manual work to reconfigure through the GUI. there's custom Java code for each client as well, which needed to pass through quality checks. So there's a very strong recommendation here. Already a Jenkins user, but it's a very strong recommendation, which was actually the initial recommendation that the customer that Tailrock acted upon, which was to adopt Jenkins Job Builder. So Jenkins Job Builder is a utility that allows you to define your build jobs and your pipelines as templates, and then you can instantiate them for each client. This really helps with consistency, and it makes jobs a lot easier to manage. What we recommended as well was to move all of the code into one core application and configure it through some external files, and separating the code and configuration in that way allowed them to consolidate to a single build pipeline, and then they could integrate that against the code, or test that against the code. This had the knock-on effect, this product consolidation strategy had the knock-on effect of dramatically simplifying the testing and branch management and traceability of the overall applications. So I just noticed a typo in my little star there, so sorry about that. That should read Maven, Jenkins and Urban Code as the tools recommendation here. So Jenkins jobs, we've just talked about that in quite some detail. The seventh recommendation really is to continue breaking down this dev test silo. So they'd already made this change of bringing their testers back in-house, having had them outsourced, but testing was still occurring very distinctly as a separate phase after development. This meant that the projects were accruing risk, and testers weren't having great visibility and understanding of the code that was getting passed through to them. There's a distinct lack of visibility around kind of current release readiness. So recommendations here were about integration testing much more closely into the development process, and this is really important, and having requirements-driven testing, requirements-driven quality management. So effectively to shift left. We talked about this earlier, which will reduce lots of costs around defect fixing time. And also advice that testers should be in the planning meetings, they should be in the daily scrums, they should be in the retrospectives, they should be given the opportunity to have a full understanding of the whole SDLC. So the eighth recommendation, again, around testing, so in the test phase at the moment, really there was quite a lot of opportunity here to do more testing effectively. There's a lot of manual testing going on, so lots of opportunity to improve upon that by implementing some testing tools. Again, a very firm tools recommendation in this particular instance, and it should be mentioned that Ranger4 does have a number of vendor partners that we work with, notably IBM, AppDynamics and CloudBees. However, we do try and make tools recommendations that make sense to our customers' current environments and their favoured vendors, and whether they favour things like open source. So tools recommendation here is Cucumber. The ninth recommendation, just generally around quality. So quality was one of the things that Tailrock really felt they could improve, and we felt, again, this is not necessarily a technical or automation or tools-based recommendation. This is actually about culture. It's not even necessarily about organisation, it's actually about empowering people. So we talk a lot about autonomy and mastery and purpose when we're trying to create functional DevOps cultures. This is about giving these QA people the involvement in the final sign-off of releases, so that they know what their role is and what their place in that process is. So giving them greater scope to police the code that's coming out of development is very important, and particularly around some of the legacy systems where sometimes processes not so well defined. And there's more testing could be done, so more kind of, we could widen and define the remit of tests further into acceptance testing and UAT and performance testing. So yeah, really we're about empowering people on this one. So the 10th recommendation, there was quite a lot of manual management of the service configuration and middleware, and we've already covered this a little bit around scripts, so we've been talking about deployments. And we've mentioned earlier that Tailrock had a go with Puppet, but it didn't kind of reach critical mass. It wasn't widely adopted for various reasons. So really we recommended that they had another crack at that. So, some very quick and significant savings that can be made by automating this environment definition and deployment. So recommendation was to have another go with Puppet. If that, maybe give it a few more resources and some more training, maybe some coaching. Alternatively, have a look at Ansible as a simpler, lighter weight alternative if that still's not working. But it couldn't be emphasised enough how significant these benefits are around infrastructure agility and consistency and traceability. So again, a couple of tools recommendations here, maybe Puppet, maybe Ansible, could be Chef. Some of this stuff can be done in Urban Code. So trying to identify which is going to be the right tool is important. 11th, nearly final recommendation, hiring or appointing a DevOps engineer or team who enables other engineers. So this is an interesting one because it's almost a bit of an anti-pattern that we're suggesting here, in that hiring a DevOps engineer isn't always the best route forward. We kind of need to develop from within, really. I was having a conversation with one of our other customers yesterday, actually, and we did start thinking of this as an anti-pattern. You can hire someone in thinking that they're going to be a breath of fresh air and that your organisation has got lots of history and habits that are holding you back from change, but actually kind of understanding that history is quite important to making the right decisions evolving forward. And sometimes we see instances where DevOps people arrive and are very excited about how they're going to change an organisation. They find it really difficult and they just kind of end up, I think the phrase that I heard yesterday was going native, but effectively just kind of doing a load of stuff, again, under the radar, which isn't what we're trying to do here. So really what we're doing there is asking, we need somebody to lead DevOps and have ownership over that. And then finally, some monitoring, some better monitoring could be used. We talked about outside in, looking outside in earlier. Monitoring really helps get an end user's perspective on it, particularly some of the newer tools. Took the firm tools recommendation that we made here was App Dynamics. So those were the high-level recommendations that we made. So where are they now? Well, this was just a few months ago, this particular engagement. So as I mentioned, the first bit that Tarot took on next was around the Jenkins jobs pieces and making that, consolidating that architecture in a way that enabled them to put some consistency through that build and integration process. They've also started making some organisational changes as per the recommendations around product owners and around the assigning or appointing somebody within the team to own DevOps moving forward. So they're quite rapidly moving to step 3 on the maturity graph, and we'll be moving further up as we move forward. So that is the DevOps Toolchain Review. As I said, it is a 3-day piece of consultancy, including the deliverable of a fully documented and written up report of recommendations on how to keep making change and what the advantages of that would be. Our standard day rate for services is £1,500 a day, so that would be £4,500. You can email me at helen.neal@ranger4.com, and I think Tej is also going to put some notes on the follow-up email around that. So just going to see if we've got some questions, which is a really good one from Chris Prowse. Thank you, Chris. Do you really think you can have DevOps done? Isn't it iterative almost by definition? I don't know, Chris, whether you've ever looked at our DevOps Friday 5 initiative that you can see on our blog. That is a question that we ask a lot of people, how to define DevOps done. And I think it's almost as difficult as just trying to define what DevOps is. I mean, it really is just IT evolving and trying to do things better, faster, smarter all of the time. So yeah, I think that's a very debatable point. Thank you for that question. Were there any other questions? Because we're coming up to the end of our allotted time today. There was a hand up earlier. So I don't think we have any more questions or comments for today. So I will thank you very much for your time, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.